George, I'm taking it that the board's work in that Leduc era and previously had a greater focus on the reservoir and related aspects, those technical aspects of regulation, than did certain of the surface and environment protection aspects that are in prominence today. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's true, although we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the practical measures, the requirements the board imposed with respect to drilling, and the provisions that the board placed on well licenses relating to drilling practice and completion practice. The operating, the board increasingly engaged staff to carry out field inspections, and these inspections related not only to currently drilling wells, but also to lease conditions. And even though environment was not as commonly of such common concern as it is today, environment was part of the board's mandate, environmental protection, and the field inspectors did their best to ensure that the conditions in the field were not destructive of the environment. But coming back to your point, yes, a good deal of the emphasis was on the reservoir and on the effect of operations on recovery. And the two things that, well, let me put it differently. We found it important first to identify the nature of the occurrence of the oil underground. For example, in Leduc, how did the oil actually occur? In the D2, or the upper zone there, the oil occurred in porous permeable rock in a band almost of its own. There was very little gas above it and very little water below it. And this D2 zone behaved in a different way than the lower and more prolific D3 zone, which had a large gas cap. That is, the oil was overlain by a large deposit of natural gas, and also an extremely large water zone underlaying it. So in the D2 zone, rate of production was not so critical, but in the D3 zone, in order to get optimum recovery, regulation of rate of production was quite critical, and that was done, as I say, by the so-called MPR. Well, sometime later, after Leduc was pretty well developed and Redwater, the productive capacity of the Alberta oil fields under good engineering practice exceeded the market demand. So in other words, we could produce more oil than we could sell. And the board had authority to regulate the production to suit the market demand, that is, to reduce production to market demand, and that was known as prorationing. So while we had this authority, the board was slow to introduce it, and it was only after a number of companies, a number of industry people pressed the board to introduce a system of prorationing, because they were concerned that they would otherwise not get their fair share of the oil and gas under their leases. So after several hearings and a number of changes, we did introduce a prorationing plan, and that was in effect for quite a number of years. As the market demand expanded, of course, the curtailment was reduced, and eventually prorationing was phased out. Another thing, of course, that you're well aware of is we had Atlantic 3. That was a major blowout in the Atlantic number 3 well in the Leduc field. And the board itself did not have the capability of managing that. But the time came when the board decided it would have to take over the operation and engage staff to get that well under control. So the board issued an order shutting in the entire Leduc field, and the operators of the Atlantic 3 well were unable to comply. So that gave the board the power to take over the ownership of that well, which it did. And here was this well spewing out oil and creating literally a surface lake of oil on that lease and beyond. As I said earlier, we didn't have the capability we didn't have within our own staff the capability of managing the control of the situation. So we went to Imperial Oil, who had very strong technical and experienced staff, and we borrowed one of their men. Tip Maroney was his name, and Tip said he would join our staff temporarily, but only if he had a completely free hand on how to shut in this well. So the board agreed to his condition, and Tip belonged to us for several months, and as you know, eventually got the well under control by drilling 2 relief wells. And by coincidence, the well actually caught fire just a few days before it was put under control, and it was producing oil for several months. Most of that oil was captured by the board, sold, revenue put in a fund. The fund was used to pay all the expenses of shutting in the well. It was a couple of $1 million, or maybe 3, I don't remember. And what was left over was given to Atlantic Oil Company as the owner of their lease. Royalties were paid. It was an interesting situation.